dismissal.
Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thanks for attending to everyone. We'll call the meeting to order at 5:31. I think the agenda is all set, so we'll move into presentations, and I think we're starting with Tom.
Thank you.
Welcome back.
Good evening. Does it matter where I stand?
Let's
assume. A little bit? Yeah, so tonight, just to walk through the audit process, as I have in the past, each year before we come in to complete the year-end audit work, we're required to review the process with you and answer any questions you might have. So you have a handout, I think, a PowerPoint in front of you. The first, page 2 is the agenda. We'll move past that. Page 3. Some of these things are just reminders. You hire us as the external auditors to give you our opinion on the fair presentation of the school district's financial statements. We're also required to report to you internal control and compliance. As we're testing transactions, and an example of that would be the board adopts a procurement policy, and that policy spells out or details when formal bids are required when purchasing from vendors, when written quotes are required. As we're testing transactions, we're auditing for compliance with your policy. Just as an example, and if we have a finding, it would be reported here in this report. Internal control related to the major programs. That's the single audit requirement, the audit of the federal programs, school lunch program, the title, remedial services type programs. And included in that is a financial statement on the federal expenditures within those programs, and then of course the extra classroom activity funds report. Management responsibilities. As we go through the audit process, it can be someone's understanding of an audit is that the auditor makes sure you have a good system of checks and balances. The auditor makes sure the records and related information is made available. That's simply not true. It's management's responsibility to maintain good systems and good checks and balances. It's management's responsibility to maintain accurate records. It's management's responsibility to provide those records in a complete and timely basis. Having said that, here in this district, the business office is very good on each of those counts. That has not been an issue in past audits, and I don't anticipate it being an issue this time through. Adjusting financial records to correct material misstatements, errors. The records have been very accurate. So again, I don't anticipate that being a problem. Bottom bullet point, audits very often will make recommendations, a corrective action to respond to that recommendation in terms of how the district will move forward with anything we note as part of the audit process. It's, and if I've met with you in the past, these slides should look fair. You know, a lot of this is just part of the audit process. Part of it is reminder. This slide speaks to a risk-based approach. Every once in a while, you'll talk to someone about an audit, and their impression or their understanding of an audit is the auditor looked at every transaction that occurred. That's simply not true. It's a documentation an evaluation of the systems and controls that are currently operating. And if we find a gap or a breakdown in a particular procedure, we're required to focus testing in on that area. Having said that, there are financial cycles that are so significant to the operations of the school district, payroll being an example. Even though your checks and balances, your systems are good, we're still testing payroll just because it is so significant to the operations. Higher risk, more testing is the idea. Key controls, I've talked about that. These are the checks and balances. These are the day-to-day controls that are in place, all the way up to, from a board level, the type of reporting you're getting and the decisions you're making based upon that reporting. The completed walkthrough of key controls, that's the testing. Once we understand the checks and balances, everything is documented, then we'll select certain transactions for testing. Communicate any potential enhancements, that's the recommendation portion of the report. We typically refer to it as a management letter, but if we have an area or finding, we'll also provide a recommendation for improvement. Then the corrective action that you adopt will build on that recommendation. Okay. Page 7, I mentioned significant audit areas or financial cycles. These are the significant financial cycles. Hopefully they all look familiar to you. They should. Okay, slide 8. Compliance, I mentioned that earlier. Compliance, whether it's for something like procurement or compliance related to the federal programs that you currently operate. Responsibilities regarding fraud risk. You as a board adopt a whistleblower policy informing employees that if a questionable activity is witnessed or observed, that there's a process for reporting that. That's the tone at the top that we always talk about. Along with that, we meet privately with employees in the business office, and we have a private conversation explaining what fraud is and have they observed any fraudulent activities that they'd like to report to us that we then can build into our audit process. Slide 10, with regard to fraud, we as auditors have to keep that front and center in our minds, that thought process of being aware of the potential for it, and as we're performing the audit steps, to always be giving consideration to that potential. Slide 11, fund balances and reserves. The financial condition of a school district, really the long-term financial planning and the ability to fund or build into the financial plan of the school district funding of reserves, and then of course use of those reserves in times when the need is presented. And so, and you as a board or audit committee know that general municipal law, state education law, authorizes the establishment and use of certain reserves. And with the reserves you're using here, we talk about fiscal stress, we talk about financial condition. And these are the year ends 2017 and 2018 comparative. If you look down the bottom where it says total fund balance increase $62,000, if that were a bracketed number, a large number, that would indicate fiscal stress. That would indicate a spend down of these fund balances that then would require some further discussion about why that's happening. Was it a planned use of the reserve, or are you using these reserves to fund operations? As you look to these reserves to fund operations, that's that concern about spending down these reserve fund balances, and what then? That's the fiscal cliff situation they talk about. So as you use or identify these use of these reserves as a revenue in a budget, it's got to be done in with a long-term perspective and done very carefully so that you don't end up in a situation where they're depleted and now what, right? Next slide. So this school district does use or identify reserves and fund balance as a revenue in a budget. If you were to, for 2018-19, if you were to spend everything in the budget and revenues came in on budget, you'd erode about $1 million in fund balance. because that's a revenue that's not an outside revenue, you're just pulling from savings, basically. Does that make sense? Yes, Nicole?
Can I just add
Yeah.
something? So as we have talked and looked at decreasing our reliance on appropriated fund balance year over year, that's one of the things that we looked at in our 1920 budget and that we did.
To begin to.
Yes, yep, we started, when I started here with that, my first budget in 17-18, and then we've just been slowly reducing that
Good.
reliance year over year.
Good. Good, I'm supportive of that, that's good. Slide 13, these are bullet points of reminder to boards. These bullet points are in every presentation I do. Review the district's reserves, purpose of the, and is the board or audit committee reviewing these reserves, purpose and balance annually? Do you have a written reserve plan? Put that one bullet there, see our article in New York State ASO, because we were published. We actually wrote an article for the school business officials newsletter, and we were able to be published there, talking about long-term plans for reserves. I know that you're doing that. I know that you continually do that. So that's really where you need to be. But believe it or not, this is still something some schools need to be doing a better job of. Any questions on that? Got a few other items. Some of this is, now well in place, but these reserves, the funding levels, that sort of information is part of the property tax report card now. Slide 15. School lunch unpaid balances has gotten some discussion among school districts. You'll probably recall that for those balances that remain unpaid, the general fund must move money into the school lunch fund to offset that. Having said that, to maintain the point of sale system and these account balances, to continue to make an effort to collect where you can. Fiscal stress, bring it up because while the state of New York, is in the state controller's office continues to analyze data provided by schools to identify schools that are either susceptible to fiscal stress or in experiencing fiscal stress. But the data, 96% of school districts are not in fiscal stress. So across the state, New York State school districts are really doing pretty well as of right now. Now that what happens going forward, with regard to the economy and so forth, I don't know, but as of the latest data, pretty good. A reminder for related to the uniform guidance, so the federal programs, the compliance over those programs was sort of rewritten, but more trying to consolidate some of the requirements. In doing that, school districts have, and I'm sure this district has too, adopted updated policy with regard to uniform guidance. But the State Education Department has performed a desk review of a few districts across the state looking specifically at this area. And while you have policy in place, they're now recommending that you should have procedures manual type documentation underneath that. And a good example of that would be at the district, an individual identifies certain costs as eligible costs for a federal program, which makes sense, and that is what happens. They want that written down. They want the person identified, how that process works. And they've done these desk reviews, but you kind of get the sense that this is going to be something they're looking closer at. So it's something to be working on and being ahead of. Other items, cybersecurity. hot button item these days. You know, I don't think there's probably anybody in the room that hasn't received a phishing email or had some, you know, unsolicited communication, kind of sort of baiting you to click on a particular. So, but in the world of audit and documentation of the risk for or potential for cyber security, we recommended last year, and I think most of the districts are now working with Wayne Finger Lakes BOCES that supports the systems to get those written risk assessments of this cybersecurity provided to the districts with recommendations for areas to strengthen. And I've heard that they're very, you know, they are, they're walking into buildings looking to see if doors are locked, looking to see if passwords are stuck to the computer screen. So they are really providing a good service in this area to help schools tighten up. The other post-employment benefit, the retiree health benefit, we're now in the second full year of reporting that liability on your balance sheet. Just as a reminder, prior to last year, you could amortize it over 30 years. It was a very gradual recognition of what the actuary calculates to be $5.3 million as of June of 18. As a reminder, you hire an actuary to analyze your employment contracts and then calculate a liability. And sort of the down and dirty idea is if you close the doors on the school, what would you owe to provide that benefit into the future based on the employment contracts. That obligation now, school districts, towns, counties, villages, state of New York, all have to report that that obligation in its entirety. So this is the second year now. It's just part of the reporting, but in some districts, the numbers are incredible in terms of what this obligation is calculated at. So yours, I think, was about $5.3 million. TRS reserve, new legislation. I'm shocked that they did this. They gave districts a place to set money aside to help smooth the effect of rate contributions to the teacher retirement system. They did it for the employee retirement system now probably 10 years ago, maybe a little longer ago than that. Now the teacher retirement system, you can do the same thing, which was really needed. There was a lot of push to get that done. Finally, it has been legislated, and school districts can make use of that reserve also. Last slide, so GASB is Governmental Accounting Standards Board. It's the standard setting board that determines what the financial statements, what they must look like. You know, what's the accounting treatment? What's the balance sheet look like? What's the income statement look like? There's a couple of new pronouncements. They're out there. This is effective June of 2020 for fiduciary funds, the trust and agency, you know, where you have the payroll withholdings, those types of liabilities, the scholarships, and they're just modifying some of the reporting to provide some additional detail. I don't see that being a big issue at all for school districts, but that it is coming. And then the other statement on leases effective June of 2021 will require some additional reporting. If you have leases, typically school districts have leases for copiers and that sort of thing, but really not a lot in the area really with leases. So I don't expect this to have a lot of impact on schools either. But these are some standards that are coming. That's a walk through the process and some of the current events with regard to the audit. You know, the audit and how we go about it. If you have any questions, We're here now, just finishing up the first phase, the interim work that we do on controls, procedures, and some testing, and then we're typically back, Nicole, in August,
The very last week in
July, to complete the year-end audit, and then, of course, I'll be back to report to you the results of that, probably September-ish.
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions,
Tim,
Tim?
just a question, I know you mentioned about whistleblowing.
Yes.
Who do the employees report to for that?
So it's it's a board policy that would tell the employee who they're required to report to, and typically it's communicated to the employees through the handbook or.
Yeah, the policy is posted, and I believe it's on our website.
So do they raise it internally, externally?
It
Or do they-
depends on who
depends
they're
on-
blowing the whistle on.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? So if
Yeah.
it's somebody blowing the whistle on me, it would be internally.
Mhm.
So if it's, the student reporting is different than the employee reporting as well, so.
And how about just like a principal or superintendent, where would the employee go for that?
To the board.
To the board?
So the board is like the last, I believe.
Not Albany or anything like that?
Nope, it's an internal, I mean, you are the last person that it would get reported to. If a teacher and a principal, it would go to the superintendent. If it were somebody on the superintendent, I assume that it would come to the board. I have to pull out the actual one to look at the process, but.
I'd be curious.
Okay, I can pull that out for you.
Yeah, whatever.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Any other questions? I think we're all set. Thanks,
Thank
Rick.
you.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Are we okay to go right into the regular meeting?
Wasn't against me, was it? We're not restarting.
Yeah.